All righty. Welcome, folks. My name is Marty West. I'm the Deputy Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's meeting of our Colloquia series. We will be back 2 weeks from today for our next meeting, where Christopher Campos from the University of California at Berkeley will be presenting some really fascinating research about school choice programs in Los Angeles. But today we have the privilege of hearing from Gaby Lohner, who is a research specialist with the Nudge for Solutions Lab at the University of Virginia. That lab is directed by Ben Castleman, who is an alum of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a friend of the Program on Education Policy and Governance. Gaby is interested in higher education policy, especially understanding how student support systems can improve outcomes for community college students. She's going to be sharing some work today that looks at how the pandemic and the shift to online instruction in community colleges has influenced students' trajectories. I was particularly interested in learning about this research because in K-12, we've done a lot of projecting of learning loss, but not a lot of actual measurement and data collection, at least to date. But in the higher ed space, it's been possible to move a little faster to assessing the impact of what we're all experiencing on student outcomes. And so you'll, I think, see what I mean by that in just a moment. So Gaby, thanks for being here. I will let you take it away.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks for all of you for joining. I'm really looking forward to presenting this research for you all. Let me go ahead and share my slides.
Have we?
Yep.
Can you see those?
Gaby, I don't know that we have sound for you.
Oh.
I can hear.
I can hear her.
Yeah.
Everybody else can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Maybe Marty's sound is.
Maybe Marty has to turn his sound down.
Yeah.
Is anyone hearing Gaby?
Yes, we are.
Does someone mind sending
Okay.
him a message, and I'll go ahead and jump in. Maybe we can get him back on. Great. So I'm assuming you all can see my slides. As Marty mentioned, I am a research specialist at the Nudge for Solutions Lab at the University of Virginia. This is going to be joint work with Ben Castleman, our director, and also Kelly Bird. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to share a ton of information today. So if I start to lose you at some point, please feel free to interrupt me and just unmute yourself and ask whatever questions you have. So this paper is called "The Negative Impacts from the Shift to Online Learning During the COVID-19 Crisis, Evidence from a Statewide Community College System." Very descriptive title. Jump into our motivation. I'm not going to spend a ton of time motivating, what happened during the COVID crisis. We're all still living through it and don't need to talk about it any more than we already do. But just to say that this impacted individuals and institutions in a lot of ways. And one of them was this sort of unprecedented move from in-person to online learning for tens of thousands of students at all levels of education and, across the US and frankly, across the world. So what we're going to do in this paper is try to isolate the impact of that move to online learning on student outcomes, and we're going to isolate it separately from any impact that COVID might have had on the student outcomes. So why should we measure this? Why is this important? We think that these results are informative on a few dimensions. So the first, which I don't know that we would have believed you if you told us this last summer when we started working on this paper, is that schools are actually continuing to make these decisions of course modalities, in-person versus online learning as the COVID crisis continues. So this is still really relevant in the COVID context. And as Marty sort of mentioned, we think that understanding the impact of this move in course modality, and as I'll show you, knowing that this is a negative impact on students can potentially justify and also guide some of these learning recovery efforts in higher ed. As he mentioned, there's a lot of this conversation happening in the K-12 sphere, maybe a little bit less so in the higher education sphere. And then another reason we want to measure this impact of the move to online learning separately from the impact of COVID itself is we think that going forward, there might be more instances where school districts, policymakers might need to make a move to online learning for students. So You know, as we are predicted to see an increase in sort of natural disasters, as horrible as that will be, that might mean students are out of school for longer. Hopefully this wouldn't be the case, but policymakers might want to move to online learning for a sort of a stopgap for when students can't make it to school. So we think it's important to understand what the impact of that move to online learning is, separate from the sort of COVID context, in case that needs to be employed in the future. So I'll give you a brief preview of our results. We're going to see that the shift from in-person to online learning led to a 6.7 percentage point reduction in student course completion. So again, this is going to be in the community college context, which I'll break down for you all in a minute. And then we also see that the effect of this move to online was worse for students who are both earlier on in their academic careers and those students who had worse pre-COVID academic performance. So I'll give you a bit of background on our context here. So we're going to be using data from the Virginia Community College System, which is 23 colleges across the state of Virginia, serve a lot of students across the state in the 2017-2018 academic year. All of the colleges served around 230,000 students. And online courses have been a pretty well-established practice at the VCCS. So the first online course was offered in 1996. Obviously, that looked a little bit different than what we think of online courses today. But since then, the number of courses and the types of courses offered and also enrollment in these courses has only increased over time. So we can see this in the 2008 to 2009 school year, around 39% of students were taking at least one online course. And we see an increase to 2018-2019, that's looking at more like 56% of students. So over half of students who are enrolled in the community college system were taking at least one course online. So just to highlight that online learning is really common at VCCS and has been a practice that has been in place even before we started really thinking about it in the COVID context. And I'll break down what the shift to online learning looked like at VCCS. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is going to feel really familiar for most of you, I think. So this is the timeline of the spring semester. Courses began on January 13th of 2020. So on March 12th, the governor of Virginia declared a state of emergency due to COVID. And so when the VCCS students returned from spring break on the 18th, everything was fully virtual. To give you a little bit of information about what this move looked like, so we don't have data on a course-to-course basis of how each professor moved their courses online. What we've gathered through conversations with the VCCS administrators is that this was essentially moving synchronous in-person courses to synchronous sort of Zoom courses. I think that's what we're all pretty familiar with, at least what most colleges did during spring 2020. And so the exception they note is that there were some professors who were teaching both the same course in person and online during this semester who, when the shift happened, might have been able to move those in-person students to sort of a more asynchronous situation because they already had some content established for that online course. But for the most part, this is going to be a move to, same time as we were meeting in person onto Zoom. So when I talk about the move to online learning, that's what you can think of that as. And so on the 24th of March, the emergency grading policy was announced at VCCS. And so I think this is actually going to look a little bit different than a lot of other colleges. So you essentially earned credit in a course if you completed the semester. The options of grading were a P+ or a P-. A P+ is going to be essentially an A through a C. It counts towards your degree requirements, and it's going to be transferable to a four-year university, which of course a lot of students at community colleges hope to do. The other grade option is a P-, which is still going to count towards your degree requirements, but it's not going to be transferable to a four-year university. So you can think of that as a D. So basically, if students finished the spring semester, they got credit towards those courses. Of course, they could still withdraw from the courses, but they couldn't fail unless they decided to opt into the traditional grading scale. The deadline to do that was early May, and this was pretty common. So in the spring 2020 semester, we see that around 70% of students opted in to the A through F grading scale for at least one of those courses, or sorry, one of their courses. So they might have been strategic about which courses to opt in for, but it does seem like a lot of students opted into this traditional grading scale.
Gaby, can I interrupt you for one moment?
Of course.
Feel free to defer this if you're going to address this later on. but
Sure.
can you give us some background on sort of success rates in Virginia community colleges at the sort of course level and at the program level, like how many students are completing their degree in a reasonable amount of time, and how common is it that they actually transfer to four-year degree programs?
Sure. So I think the VCCS is really sort of representative of the broader community college landscape, and the fact that only around a third of students actually graduate within 150% of time. So for an associate's degree, that's going to be around 3 years. We see a lot of the same issues with, again, the broader community college landscape about students earning way too many credits that don't count towards their degrees, and then students who drop out as they're getting close to finishing their degrees. So it's unfortunately, it has the same sort of issues as a lot of community colleges, but again, around a third of students are going to go on to complete their degrees. Does that sort of answer those
Yeah, I guess
questions?
the one piece of information that you didn't provide it would be the sort of pass rate at the course level, since that's ultimately what you're going to be looking at.
Sure. I do have a sort of breakdown of what this looked like in spring 2020. A lot of students earn good grades. It's not super common to get Fs. The A is going to be the most common grade that we're seeing these students earn. A lot of students earn As and Bs. Students do withdraw probably at higher rates than four-year universities, but I would say it's pretty common for students to earn credit in their courses, but then just to not continue on with their degree and finish their degree.
Great.
I'll try to provide some more specific information on that later, but yeah. Great. So just to wrap up this timeline, so essentially what we're seeing is that students had 2 months of pre-COVID normal instruction, again, which is pretty much what happened around the country in these higher education contexts, and then 2 months of post-COVID all virtual instruction. I'll describe our data for you all a little bit. So we have access to administrative data from the VCCS. This is going to give us detailed student by term level information starting in around the year 2000. So we're going to have for each semester the student's program of study, all of the courses they attempted or completed, the grades they earned in each of those courses, demographic information including gender, race, parental education, and zip code, degrees awarded by the VCCS starting in 2006, and then also information on financial aid disbursements. We're going to match this data with some other administrative data sources. So we match to quarterly employment records from the VEC, the Virginia Employment Commission. We're going to see students in the employment data for 5 years before their initial enrollment at the VCCS, and then sort of infinitely during and after they're enrolled. Then we also have data matched to the National Student Clearinghouse, which of course is going to provide us information on non-VCCS enrollment and graduation outcomes. So I'll break down our sample a little bit. I am going to just briefly introduce our empirical strategy because I think it's important for understanding our sample. So we're going to use a diff and diff estimation here. Our first difference is going to be students who started the semester in courses that were online versus in person. And our second difference here is going to be the spring 2020 semester versus the 4 previous spring semesters. So spring 2016 to 2019 is going to be our pre-period. So using this method, our treated group is going to be students who started the spring 2020 semester in person. And of course, these are going to be the students who were shifted to online learning halfway through the semester. And our main outcome of interest is going to be whether students earned credit in a course. So again, this means that they didn't fail the course, didn't withdraw or receive an incomplete. We're also going to look at whether students failed and withdrew from a course separately. So moving into our sample, we're going to grab these sort of detailed student by course records and divide students into our sample groups based on whether those courses were taught online or in person. We're going to make one big restriction at the course level, and so that's going to be that the courses that we're including in our sample must have been offered both in person and online during spring 2020, and also at least one previous semester. So we're going to do this for a couple of reasons. The first is ensuring that the course was taught in person and online in spring 2020 is going to make sure the courses that we're looking at that were moved online actually can be taught online. So there's sort of a concurrent course teaching the exact same information in the online setting. As with a lot of community colleges, the VCCS has a lot of vocational programs and sort of hands-on learning programs. So this restriction is going to remove anything like a welding course that really just can't practically be taught in an online environment. And the second reason we make this restriction is making sure that these courses have been taught in these modalities during the spring 2020 semester is just going to make sure sort of the course composition of the courses students are enrolled in during that semester is similar over time. So our results would be biased if, for example, there were a ton of new courses offered online during spring 2020, that's their first time being offered online. It just doesn't work in that environment. And so students struggled. So we just want to make sure that we're only including courses that have been taught in those modalities before those sort of kinks have been worked out, and we're keeping the course composition over time pretty constant. So our sample is going to be defined then at the student by course level, which means that students are going to show up in the sample multiple times. So they can, of course, show up in multiple semesters if they were enrolled, say, in an online course in spring 2019 and spring 2020. They're going to be in both of those sample groups. And they also can show up within the same semester in both our in-person and online group if they have enrollment in both in-person and online courses. So just to note that. Of course, our outcome is defined at the student by course level, so this shouldn't be an issue. So like I mentioned, we're going to grab the students enrolled in these two types of courses during the 2016 to 2020 spring semesters that meet this course restriction. We make a couple of other restrictions to our sample as well that are much smaller than this, that I won't get into just for the sake of time, but that are included in the paper. And so once we do that, we're going to have 1,100,087 student by course observations, which is going to be 295,515 unique students in our sample.
Gaby?
Sure.
Can I ask a question? Hi, Eric Taylor.
Of course. Hi.
So you just were mentioning that one motivation for the first restriction, the first big bullet point is courses that had been taught online before, and so there's at least some experience with that, which seems sensible. But if I understand correctly, like included in your main sample then will be courses that were not taught online in spring of 2019. Maybe they had been taught online at some point before, but in 2019 they weren't being taught online, and in 2020 they were. It seems like the other consideration here is selection into, you're following these two cohorts, online and not online, over time. And it seems like if the course wasn't being taught online in 2019, there's sort of a different selection into online, not online. I mean, online doesn't exist. So anyway, sort of long story short, I wonder, one simple test might be to restrict your sample just to a robustness test, just to cases where it was always taught online and in person in every year of your data. I don't know, maybe you've already done that. But.
Sure. We haven't. We've made a restriction where we look at instructors who have only taught one of those modalities, but we haven't restricted to just the course. So just to make sure I'm understanding. So we make sure that a course has been taught in the same modality it was taught in spring 2020 in at least one previous semester, but it doesn't have to be every single semester. Is that sort of the concern
Yes,
that you're getting at?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Like in 2019, if the course wasn't taught online, then there is no online. Some students will be forced to take it in person, or maybe they won't take it at all, but the online trend is potentially different into that, the group of in-person is potentially different in 2019.
Sure. Yeah, I see what you're getting at, and that makes sense as a robustness check. Thank you for that. And something that I also forgot to mention is just that we're also going to use this restriction as a way to include a course level fixed effect to hopefully sort of get at differences and difficulty between these courses, but great. So I will break down these demographic characteristics of these two groups really briefly. Of course, when we're using a diff and diff, we don't need these two groups to look the exact same. We just need these differences to be the same over time, which I'm going to show you is true. But this is our demographic characteristics for these two groups in the spring 2020 semester. So just to highlight a few things, the group of students that are enrolled online are a few years older than the in-person students. Both groups are going to be majority female and majority white. Looking at sort of their prior academics, so coming into the spring 2020 semester, their previous GPA was pretty similar. This group of online students had around 6 more credits completed coming into the semester, which again might just be related to the fact that they're a few years older, they're a little bit further on in their academic careers. Unsurprisingly, 80% of our students who were taking an online course in spring 2020 had taken a course online at BCCS before. Around half of the in-person students have experience online previously. And again, I think this just points to the fact that online course taking was really popular even before COVID. And then the last thing is just looking at the number of current credits attempted. This is about the same for these two groups, which is good because knowing in the COVID context that the sort of workload was similar for these two groups is what we want to see. So I'm going to describe our empirical strategy in a bit more detail. I'm going to sort of walk through the assumptions of the diff and diff and show you proof of them. So the first assumption here is going to be pre-COVID parallel trends and outcome. Of course, that's going to mean that in our 4 pre-COVID spring semesters, the likelihood of earning credit in a course, whether it's online or in person, is going to be stable over time. So I will show you this with our raw trends. Feel free to ignore the spring 2020 outcomes here. We're going to talk about those obviously in more detail later. This is just going to be, like I mentioned, the sort of raw means of the percentage of students who received credit in a course in previous semesters. So this might, Marty, sort of get at your question of how common it is for students to earn credit. Fairly common. You know, there's a group of students who are not going to earn credit, whether they're failing or withdrawing, but you know, upwards of 80% of the in-person students and around 75% of the online students. And so again, while we see a 3 to 4 percentage point difference in whether students earn credit in these courses based on sample group, this is pretty consistent over time. So we think these parallel trends are going to be met. And we also looked at this for the other 2 outcomes I mentioned of withdrawing and failing from a course. I'm not going to show you those in the interest of time, but those are in the paper, and pre-trends are also met there. We also ran this in an event study context, so this is going to be regression adjusted. Again, ignore spring 2020 here, but looking at those pre-trends, of course, these are going to be the difference between in-person and online learning compared to the spring 2019 semester. And again, we're seeing that we're sort of crossing through 0. So we think those pre-trends are going to be met. So that's our first assumption. Our next assumption, like I mentioned, is that group composition remains consistent over time. So again, we can see differences in what these 2 groups look like, but we want those differences to be constant over time, and we want that to include the spring 2020 semester. I'll show you this for just 2 of our demographic characteristics. We tested this for a bunch of demographic and academic characteristics in this event study context. And overall, we're meeting this sort of parallel trends in sample composition. These 2 are just looking at the share of female students in each group and the share of underrepresented minority students in each group. Again, we're sort of crossing through 0 with all of these estimates. So we think that these parallel trends in sample composition, again, are going to be met. The third assumption to use a diff and diff is that students didn't select into treatment. Of course, as we just sort of talked about, students select into in-person versus online learning, but since our treatment here is going to be the sort of shift to online learning because of COVID, and students enrolled in courses and had 2 months under their belt of their courses before COVID really hit in the US, we think that it's really unlikely that students sort of anticipated this move to online learning and adjusted their enrollment based on that. Of course, you know, in January and February of last year, there were some news stories coming out of different countries of, you know, COVID happening. And I think we were thinking it might happen to us, but at the same time, I think in the US, we were really sort of surprised at how quickly it hit. And for that reason, we don't think that students differed their course enrollment based on the idea that COVID was coming. And then finally, this is sort of a big assumption that I would really appreciate your feedback on. The assumption we're making here is that the impact of COVID is going to be the same for both groups. So we don't have any interaction effects of in-person or online students experiencing COVID in different ways that's going to affect their academic outcomes. So essentially, we're assuming any sort of health, employment, mental health, all these ways that COVID affected us is going to be similar across these two groups. If this assumption isn't true, it's going to make it a bit harder to get at the impact of just the move to online learning versus, again, this sort of interaction between online learning and COVID. So unfortunately, unlike the previous assumptions, I can't just prove this for you right now. We have a couple things that we're doing to try to get at this assumption that I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation. One of them is doing some robustness checks based on employment level data, and the other one is going to be actually testing a student fixed effect model that we think is going to get at this a bit more concretely. And so just to call out a few notable differences between these two groups that might be correlated with how COVID affected them. So again, I mentioned that both of these two groups are majority female. We know that females sort of bore a lot of the childcare responsibilities and some sort of differential employment effects of COVID. And so while both of the groups, the online and in-person students, are both majority female, the group of online students is around 2/3 female compared to just over half of the in-person students. So around a 10 percentage point differential between those two that might be sort of correlated with differential effects of COVID. And then the other thing is that we know that minority students, people of color, sort of experience COVID differently, more likely to get sick with the virus, have a bad case of the virus. And so while both groups are majority white, we also see that the in-person students are around 5 percentage points less likely to be white, more likely to be Black or Hispanic. So again, it's sort of unclear that these two groups are so different that off the bat, we would say they for sure experience COVID differently. But like I mentioned, this is harder to test. We would appreciate your feedback on this, and I will break down what we're doing to try to get at this assumption towards the end of the presentation.
Gaby,
Let me go ahead.
A quick question that may be related to that. If I understood the slide a couple back showing completion rates over time, it looked like what happened in spring 2020 was actually that there was a jump up in the completion rates of the online course takers.
That is correct.
So that seems to suggest that there is something different going on over time with that group, whether it's the impact of COVID or not. So just sort of, maybe we can come back to that later if you prefer to show the main results first, but I think it's important to sort of have that in the background as we think about that assumption.
Definitely. Yes, I will go ahead and show those results now, and I'm actually going to talk about that jump up. I'll talk through our regression equation really quickly. So we have a course outcome here for student S and course C taught by instructor I at term T. We're going to include indicators both for if the course was an in-person course and if it was during the spring 2020 semester, which we're calling our sort of COVID indicator here. Our coefficient of interest here is going to be beta 3, which is the interaction between spring 2020 and in-person courses. So again, this is the students who were moved online halfway through the semester. We're going to control for a ton of demographic characteristics such as, student level characteristics such as demographics, program of study, prior academic experiences at BCCS and at non-BCCS colleges, and then some information about the specific section of each course that the student was enrolled in. We're going to look at time variant instructor level covariates, such as tenure at BCCS and full-time versus adjunct status, time invariant instructor level covariates, such as sex and race. And then finally, like I mentioned, we're going to include a course level fixed effect to sort of control for difficulty of a course, likelihood of passing, just based on what sort of course you're taking. So to jump into these results, again, for the main outcome of whether students received credit, here's that same event study plot. So our coefficient here is going to be negative 0.067. So we see a 6.7 percentage point reduction in receiving credit, so course completion, for those students who were enrolled in in-person courses and were moved online halfway through the semester. So as Marty just mentioned, looking at the raw trends, again, these aren't regression adjusted, but it's sort of interesting that we see this increase in completion for students who started the semester online and didn't experience this change in course modality. We think this has to do with that emergency grading policy that I sort of described earlier, that again, students really couldn't fail and not receive credit if they make it through the semester. If they opt into the normal grading policy, they can then receive an F. And of course, if they withdraw from a course, they're not going to receive credit. But if they stick it out through the end of the semester, even if they receive that P- grade, they're earning credit towards their course. So we think that that's why we see an increase here for online students, is that this emergency grading policy was pretty generous for these students. But when you couple that with the decrease for students who started in person and were moved online, that's going to get us to around that 6.5 percentage point decrease. Any questions there? Did that answer your question, Marty?
Yeah, I had forgotten about the emergency grading or assumed that it didn't apply to the people whose modality didn't change, but you're saying it applied across the board. Because I was starting to think about explanations like, I don't know, having more time at home for people who are in an online class all of a sudden, but what you suggest is much more plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I should have clarified that. So the emergency grading policy is for all of VCCS, no matter how, what modality you started the semester in, that's going to be for everybody. So again, these online students, so they didn't experience this sort of change in their course structure, are still going to have the benefit of having that emergency grading policy.
So let me, if I may, just follow up on that.
Sure.
Is your estimated effect a combination of the increase that we see in course completion among the in-person group and the decrease in the online group? And you're nodding yes. So that makes me wondering here, what is really driving this, this coefficient? Is it the fact that the grading practices have changed?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it, the move to online learning? Because there's two things that are happening simultaneously here. One is a change in grading practice, and the other is moving to online. So if the change in the grading practice is going to keep people in the course because you almost have to do nothing and you'll still get credit for it. But on the other hand, switching to online is really sort of an uncomfortable experience for somebody who's been doing it in the classroom and all of a sudden may not have a computer or may have all kinds of other obstacles to getting it online. You might have an underestimate here.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that comment, definitely. No, but I mean, I think you're right. And so I think if we sort of play out that idea a little bit more, so since we have these pre-trends in the outcome, I think if we, looking at just that in-person line, if we imagine that for whatever reason, we just moved to, this emergency grading policy and these in-person students weren't moved to online learning, I think we would sort of see the same increase for those students. We expect the graph to jump up like that as well. So yeah, but I would agree. It's sort of tough to see between all of the things that are happening all at once, but we think this is probably a pretty strong estimate of what those in-person students experienced.
Well, it really highlights the value of the diff and diff identification strategy. I think the key assumption that wasn't like explicitly stated, or maybe it's one aspect of your last assumption that you said is hard to test, is that the effect of COVID, in this case, the effect of the shift in grading practice was the same for both groups, right? And that is what you're depending on to isolate the effect of the shift in mode. So
definitely, yeah. Yep.
Gaby,
you might also expect that if you're going to a class in person, you're really committed to sticking with the course. And of course, now you've got lots of good reasons. Whereas if you're online, you may or may not. We know people drop out more frequently if it's an online experience.
Yeah, and I'll actually show you that in a minute. But I agree, we know that students are sort of making these decisions to take courses in person and online for different reasons. But again, relying on this diff and diff, where we're just sort of assuming that over time, those reasons between students are going to be the same across these semesters is going to be the sort of, like Marty mentioned, the main use of the diff and diff in this situation. Eric, did you have a question?
Just one idea to respond to your question about like thoughts about that big jump in the green trend.
Sure.
That aren't just the grading thing. So my prior is that a predictor of taking a course online is sort of physical distance from the campus, and the campuses are probably located in population centers, right? So
yep.
One thing that happened, so if I'm somebody who lives far away from the population center, so I'm more likely to take a course online. Maybe I'm also commuting a lot for work because I live far, right? So the pandemic comes along, I don't have work to go to. I have a whole lot more time on my hands now, right? Because I'm not commuting, which I could then spend on working on my studies. So if you can observe where people live, and maybe you can observe where they work if you have the UI data. I don't know how detailed the UI data are, but that might be one thing to explore, that sort of physical.
Yeah, that is a very interesting hypothesis. And we have student zip code, so we could look at, distance to the zip code of, or the location of the college. So that's definitely something we could look at. The UI data, we have like the headquarters of where they're working. So if they're working at like a Starbucks, it's going to be in Seattle. So that might not be great, but yeah, we have student zip code. So I really like that thought. Thanks for raising that. Great. So let me move through these a little bit more. I'll just briefly show you these outcomes of, again, we broke it down by whether students were whether they withdrew from a course. Our point estimate here is going to be around a 5 percentage point increase in withdrawing from a course for students who were moved online. So again, we can see in the raw trends that typically these in-person students were less likely to withdraw, and they're going to jump up to withdraw at higher rates than the online students. So again, this might indicate, that students didn't want to take this course online. They chose the course in person for a reason, and that's the experience they really wanted. Or maybe it's just that they really struggled with that move-in modality, so they were more likely to withdraw from this course. And then, of course, we looked at the outcome of whether they failed. So as a reminder, students had to opt into this A through F grading scale. So they opted in, and then they received an F in this course, which I find to be a little sad. But so we're going to see a 1.5 percentage point increase in failing a course for those students, again, who are moved online. Like we were talking about, we see that failure decreases a lot for both of these groups, so really close to zero, essentially. But for these students who were moved online, they're going to see around a percentage point and a half increase in failing compared to online students. So we also ran some subgroup estimates. We ran these both by demographics of the students and by academic history. I'm going to focus on the academic history here, but those demographic estimates are included in the paper. So we broke students into GPA terciles coming into the spring 2020 semester. So this is for students who were enrolled at BCCS previously and for whom we had a GPA. So we see that students who came in with the lowest third of GPAs saw a stronger negative impact of this move to online learning. So around a 10 percentage point decrease in course completion. We can compare that to students with the highest GPAs who only saw around a 3.3 percentage point decrease in course completion. And the same sort of story is true for prior credit accumulation. So students who came into spring 2020 with 0 credits accumulated. So this can be because they were never enrolled at BCCS before, or because they were enrolled and they had failed or withdrew from all of their courses. The point estimate there is going to be around an 8.8 percentage point reduction compared to students with 30 plus credits. We're looking at around 5.5. So again, we think these point to the fact that it was these students, it seems like all students really struggled with this move to online learning, but students who were sort of in the lowest GPA categories or had the fewest credits accumulated were hurt worse than students who were further along or sort of doing better in their academic careers. And so now I'm going to bring us back to this question of potential differential effects of COVID. So I'm going to talk about this really explicitly. Both of the things I'm going to talk about in this section are things that we have just recently included. These are not in the paper, so we would really appreciate your feedback on, whether these are what we should be doing to get at this concern of potential differential effects. So the first, I've mentioned this employment data. We just recently received data for quarters 1 and 2 in spring 2020. So sorry, in 2020. So this is going to allow us to sort of explore whether employment outcomes differed around the time that the pandemic hit. So of course, quarter 1 is going to end in March and quarter 2 begins in April for these two groups of students. And so let me just describe a few limitations of this data. The first is that these are going to be based on UI records, so we don't have any federal employment or self-employment records. Of course, federal employment is especially popular in Northern Virginia, close to DC, which is also where one of the biggest colleges in the VCCS is located. And then we're only going to see if a student is employed during the quarter. We're going to see their wages during the quarter, and like I mentioned, the headquarters of who they are working for. But we don't see when they're employed, so we don't see when they got hired. If they lost a job or left the job, we don't see when they leave. So we don't have a really fine level of detail there, but we're just going to be able to see, okay, they were employed for employer X during quarter 1. So we've kept it pretty simple for these sort of first tests of the employment data. I'm going to show you breaking down based on which group, sample group the students were in, and then looking at 2020 versus 2019. So the first thing to note here is that the sort of change over quarter in 2020 looks the same for these two groups of students, or at least pretty similar. So online students start with a higher percent of students employed, but they're going to be dropping both around 5 percentage points, 4 percentage points change in employment. So it doesn't seem like one of these groups had a massive change in employment compared to the other. But when we look at this compared to 2019, what we see is that typically in-person students see a bigger jump of employment into quarter 2. So again, quarter 2 is going to include some of this summer employment, which isn't really related to our spring semester analysis, but this is the best we can do. So again, our takeaway is going to be that there weren't huge differential effects in 2020, but when we compare this to the sort of counterfactual of what these two groups would have experienced without COVID, it seems like maybe these in-person students are hurt a little bit more when it comes to employment. And so to test this a little bit more, we construct this really rough measure of job loss. So this is essentially going to be take value 1 if the student was employed in quarter 1 and they weren't employed in quarter 2. So we see them in the records in quarter 1, but not in the second quarter. So if you look down at the 2019 breakdown of job loss, it's the same for these two groups of students. But when we look at 2020, we're going to see that in-person students were around a percentage point more likely to have lost a job during 2020. This is a pretty small impact, we think, but it might be some indication of a differential effect. So we're going to really sort of play this out. So to think about this scenario a little bit more, if we think that differential rates of job loss, so if we think that losing a job, or, again, we don't really know if it's losing a job or the student decided not to be employed, we're going to think due to COVID, it's probably loss of job. But if we think not being employed in the second quarter is going to hurt academic performance in that semester, it might be the fact that we see that these in-person students, who of course were the ones who were moved online, are seeing higher rates of job loss. That could be driving the negative result that we're estimating here. And so we're going to expect our results are going to be sensitive to the inclusion of these students. So what we're going to do as a robustness check is just take them out of the sample. We're only going to run the sample of students who didn't lose a job during the first 2 quarters of 2020. And we find that our results are really robust when we include these students to when we do not include them. So I put the point estimates here. Go ahead.
If I can interrupt, why don't you just compare the two groups? I mean, this is the descriptive. You've moved away from an experimental or diff and diff design here, I think. So why don't you just sort of compare the two groups of students?
So we're still running this in the diff and diff design. We're just going to remove those students from our sample. But so you mean just looking at like—
Yeah, once you've done that, you violated a lot of the assumptions that you've previously—
Sure.
You've added some further. I mean, you've assumed what you're inquiring into. It seems to me. Yeah.
Sure. And so you think we should just sort of look at the demographic characteristics of these two groups in a bit more detail?
And see whether or not my guess is you're going to see some concentration on there, but I don't know how much, but it's just going to be descriptive data.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. That is certainly something we can do. Great. So just to move forward with this a little bit further, the other test we do is we, since we just got these employment covariates, we're going to include those in the model. And again, our results are going to be robust to looking at these employment covariates, so such as job loss, change in average wages over time. So our main takeaway here, again, is that we might see that employment outcomes are going to be a little different across these two groups during the 2020. The start of 2020, that difference doesn't seem to be driving our results, but again, employment is just one area of life that the pandemic affected. So, these aren't really comprehensive tests, but the next model I'm
What
going to
you're
show
really
you.
doing here, it seems to me, is looking to see if this is a moderator, if this is one of the pathways that explains your difference. It's really not a matter of whether your finding is valid once you take this into account, but rather what's the mechanism? What are some of the mechanisms that might be explaining why you're getting your results? So that'd just be another way of looking at
Sure.
this particular set of data.
Yes, that sounds much nicer than how I just described it. So thank you for that.
Gaby, if I may, I've been having this thought since the start of your presentation, and just jumping off the point about how it's difficult to track self-employment in this context. I was reading an article yesterday that a lot of post-secondary students through COVID have actually been leaving their studies to pursue more entrepreneurial initiatives. And I wonder if tracking that would actually further your research a little bit in this, and whether that's tracking self-employment rates, or maybe even, I know you're looking into field of study a little bit more, whether or not those students are performing well in business related courses. Just a quick thought that I had, and just jumping off of that point there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that. That is certainly, a big limitation of this data. We would love to know if students were starting their own businesses or, whatever, but that would be something interesting to explore for sure. Thank you for that.
And Gaby, I guess kind of building on this conversation, this is Monica, by the way, I'm a PhD student at the education school here. Hi, yeah, thanks for this. This was great. I guess I'm curious why you decided to kind of separate out your sample as opposed to maybe doing a triple difference. And
that is a good question. We had not thought about a triple difference, but it sounds like that is something we could use. So like I mentioned, we ran these results like last week, so these are really fresh, and we definitely appreciate any additional thoughts. So we will definitely look into that model a bit more.
Monica, you also had a question that you put in the chat that I think it would be interesting to bring into the conversation. Do you want to share that as well?
Sure, yeah, happy to, Marty, thanks. Yeah, so I guess something that I've kind of tried to grapple with in the shift to online is what happened to student services and tutoring, and kind of, I guess, how are you thinking about this treatment? Is it just an online course, or is it having everything moved online? And I guess related to that, I'm trying to think of, if I'm an in-person student and I sign up to take a class in person, is that because I'm hoping to have sort of in-person academic advising and tutoring available to me? And so then that might make kind of this movement to online affect me differently than a student who signs up for an online course. And so I guess I'm just trying to think through that intuitively in terms of thinking about this model and the diff and diff and what the treatment is capturing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think when we've been thinking about the sort of treatment, we really have thought about just this move to online learning, because again, whatever these in-person students are experiencing is going to be the same as what those online students are experiencing. But it is a good point that, an in-person student is probably signing up for courses or taking courses in person because they want to have that experience of being able to pop in and talk to their academic advisor, or, get tutoring, in the library or whatever it is. So I know that the schools have moved a lot of their advising, of course, online. I know that they are trying to continue with the same student supports. We work really closely with one of the schools that is here in Charlottesville near UVA, and they've done a really good job of continuing to support students via Zoom. So I think they're doing their best. I don't know what this really looked like in the spring 2020 semester, again, when all of us were just sort of taking in the massive hit of COVID and didn't have a chance to sort of get everything together. But that is a very good question, and something that we should probably lay out with a bit more clarity in the paper. Thanks for that, Monica.
Thank you.
Great. So let me go ahead and really quickly present the student fixed effect model. And again, this is super fresh, hot off the press. I think this is going to get at a lot of the concerns with our main model, specifically that sort of differential effect of COVID. So what we're going to do here is we're going to grab students who were enrolled during the spring 2020 semester in both online and in-person learning. So we're going to have the same students in both of these two groups. Again, this is going to sort of eliminate the concern that COVID affected one of these two groups of students differently, because again, those online and in-person students are going to be the same students. So we know for a fact that COVID affected them in the same way. And what we're going to do is we're going to, again, employ a diff and diff model here, plus these student fixed effects to account for whatever differences there may be within students to choose in-person or online learning. Of course, we know that students are choosing these modalities for different reasons. Again, we're going to try to account for that fact. Using these pre-trends, we think that students probably employed the same sort of decision-making in spring 2020 between in-person and online learning as they did in previous semesters. So I'll describe this sample really quickly. Like I mentioned, we're going to grab students who were enrolled in at least one person and at least one online course during spring 2020. We're also going to restrict the sample even more to include just students who meet that spring 2020 restriction and at least one previous spring semester. So they must have been enrolled in online and in-person learning from in at least one spring semester 2017 to 2019 and the spring 2020 semester. So that of course is going to allow us to look at how students perform differently in a semester where they have both types of learning and then compare that to the spring 2020 semester. This, of course, is going to restrict our sample a lot. So we're going to have 3,184 unique students and 26,007 student by course observations. And so just to give you an idea of what the sample looks like compared to the main specification, on demographics, they look really similar. So again, majority female, majority white. The big difference here, which I think, again, is going to be sort of mechanically true because of how we're defining this sample, is going to be prior academics. So students who are included in the student fixed effect specification have around double the credits passed than students in the main specification. Of course, we're restricting that they have taken a course online in the past, so 100% of them have had some experience with online learning. Around a quarter of them have a prior VCCS degree. So again, these students are just a bit further along in their academic careers. And they're attempting around a credit and a half more during the spring 2020 semester as compared to the main specification. So again, just to highlight the fact that this is a pretty selective group of students. It's not as broad as the model I presented earlier. And also just to highlight that this really isn't a robustness check. This is more of an additional specification that we're testing. We don't expect our results to be the exact same because these samples are so different, but you know, we're hoping to see that they're similar, and I'll show you that they are. Again, just to break down the model really quickly, this is going to look similar to the one I just presented. Big changes here are going to be that we're adding in a student level fixed effect, of course. We're actually going to swap out that course level fixed effect for a set of variables that is sort of trying to get at the same thing. So this is going to include percent of students who earned an A or a B in a course, who withdrew, who received an incomplete, and who failed. And that's going to be at the course by semester level for all historic students who took that course. So we do this because this course level fixed effect is actually going to eat up a lot of degrees of freedom in this model. And also because in the student fixed effect model, we don't see the same courses over time. So we don't make as many restrictions with regards to the types of courses we're looking at. So we actually don't have historic records for all courses to be able to include that course level fixed effect. Just to jump into our results really quickly, I know we're sort of running out of time, but our estimate here with the student fixed effect model is going to be negative 0.0405, so around a 4 percentage point decrease in course completion. Compare that again to 6.5 in the main model. And so like I mentioned, we don't really expect this to be the same result. I think that these results are broadly consistent with what we saw before. So again, even looking within the same groups of students, for the courses that they were taking in person that were moved to online learning, those students are 4 percentage points less likely to have received credit in those courses.
Gaby, just one observation, I
Sure.
very much agree with your point that you wouldn't expect the results to be identical, but it sort of makes sense that the impact may be less severe with students who have prior experience with online learning. So
yeah, definitely. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, in our main model, we also run a subgroup of students who have prior online learning, and we see that I think the estimate is around 5 or 4 percentage points. So a little bit less than the 6.5, but yeah,
so
and we would certainly
that's perfectly
expect,
consistent with this then. So
yes, definitely. Great. So then looking at our other outcomes here of failed, again, students had to opt in to the A through F to fail. Our original estimate was an increase of around 5 percentage point of failing those courses that were moved online. And our student fixed effect estimate here is going to be around 3.5 percentage points. So still, broadly consistent with our main findings. The one thing that we're having issues with that we would definitely appreciate your feedback on. So looking at the outcome of whether students withdrew, the first thing to note here is that our pre-trends do not look great. For some reason, there was a big decrease in students withdrawing from in-person courses in spring 2018. We have not figured out why this is happening yet. I'm going to do maybe a bit more of a dive into sort of the policy side of things and see if we can figure out why students were less likely to withdraw during that semester. But ignoring those pre-trends, the other question that we have is, so we're seeing that our student fixed effect estimate is actually going to flip signs here as compared to our main estimate. So the original one was around 1.5 percentage points increase in withdrawing. With this estimate, we're going to see around 1.5 percentage points decrease in withdrawing. So, I'm not sure if for some reason the students who selected into in-person and online learning, maybe there's a reason that they're selecting the in-person learning. It's more of an important course to them, so that when things are moved online and things get tough, they're less likely to withdraw from that course. But like I mentioned, we're sort of not sure what to make of this. We would definitely like your feedback on this student fixed effect model in general, but also what to think about this outcome, especially considering that pre-trends look good for the other two and they're broadly consistent with what we saw in the previous model. So let me just give a few final takeaways and then maybe we can open up the discussion. So our results show that the shift to online courses does appear to have led to worse outcomes for students who experience that move online. Again, this is relevant as we continue to fight COVID and also for future situations that could lead policymakers to want to make a move to online courses. And so, again, like Marty mentioned, there are a lot of discussions of learning recovery in the K through 12 sphere. We think that based on these results, these conversations might also be necessary in higher education. So we're definitely seeing that students are taking a hit from this move to online learning. And something that we're really interested in considering is whether this could include sort of re-enrollment efforts for students who were on track for success, but were derailed by COVID. We think that some of our subgroup estimates might be sort of helpful in figuring out who specifically those students that we should try to target with these re-enrollment efforts would be. So again, I'll open it up to questions and comments. I really appreciate your time. I put my email here in case you are interested in sending me some more thoughts as you let this sort of sit in. I know that was a lot of information, but thanks again for taking the time.
I may have misunderstood you, Gabby, but I think what you're saying is that when you did the fixed effects for student and the student fixed effects, that you got the signs reversed, and that could be either because you have such a different sample there. It's a very small group compared to the larger group, and it's really quite different in important respects. So is it the difference in the sample, which would be perfectly understandable why you would get this? Is with a more selected sample, maybe, the effects of going online are going to be much different. They're much more committed to completing their degree program. Now all of a sudden you can easily complete it with this change in the grade policy. Is it the change in the sample, or is the fixed effects model actually getting you the real result? So I sort of think it is the change in the sample, but I mean, that's sort of the bullet to bite there, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is definitely a tough question to get at. I think I am probably on the same page as you that this is a very different sample. Again, I think looking at the two groups of students broadly, students might choose online or in-person learning for a variety of reasons. But when you're looking within one specific student, I think that's going to be even more extreme. So, if a student has to take a really hard class, maybe and something that they have to take to get their degree, maybe they're going to want to take that course in person just to, have that sort of differential experience. And So then when things are moved online, they made that decision in the beginning of the semester, they have to take that course. It's easier for them to drop, the easy course they decided to take online. Again, that's just the sort of the way I'm thinking about it. But I agree that I think it's probably at least partially driven by the sample. I think our question here is, does that make sense? And also, should we really be taking much from this estimate given the pre-trends, don't look amazing?
I think there are reasons
big
to be
drop.
skeptical of it based on the pre-trends. And I certainly don't think it's enough to sort of cast doubt on the findings for the full sample. I think,
Sure.
But one question that you might look at is, you mentioned doing a subgroup analysis within the full sample based on prior exposure to online courses. I don't know if you've done that for the withdrawal outcome and whether you see a similar pattern here. So
I'm sure we did, but I do not remember the results. So I will have to double check that. But yeah,
may speak to it in some way. But
definitely.
Look, I think, and we probably should take a moment to formally thank you for the really excellent presentation before some people, including me in a moment, need to sign off shortly after the 1 o'clock time. So this is really great work, and really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to be here.
So as I mentioned, I need to jump into another obligation pretty soon. I know there are a number of people who would be interested in continuing the conversation. So I'm going to encourage people to chime in with questions and comments, but I'm going to need to sign off in the next minute or so here.
Sure. Thanks so much, Marty. And I have nothing going on all afternoon. So if any of you want to stay and ask me questions about this, feel free. Happy to answer those.
I just had a quick question about the is the pricing the same for online versus in person? And if the student withdraws, do they get their money back? And are most of these students financing this themselves, or is it loan money? And so if you withdraw, how does that affect, if it's a Pell Grant or a loan, or because
Sure.
The student may need to drop out, not just if they become unemployed, but if their parent or spouse who's paying for it gets unemployed, or.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not positive about the pricing. I would guess that the online courses are going to be a bit cheaper. I actually took an online course at the VCCS last semester, and it was, I think, around $500 just for the full semester. So I'm guessing that the online courses are a bit cheaper than the in-person. But to your question about whether they get their money back, there is, of course, a withdrawal period that they can get reimbursed for those courses. I'm pretty positive that by the time COVID hit in the middle of March, that had passed. So if you are to withdraw, you're not going to get reimbursed. We double checked this with the VCCS, and they said this is correct. There weren't any changes to the sort of financial part of the withdrawal policy. And then, so looking at the money side of things, so again, we showed that around 65% of these online students are working. I think this shows that a lot of these students are probably funding themselves. Around a third of the students at the VCCS receive a Pell Grant. So a pretty substantial share of them are going to be receiving federal money and sort of loan money to pay for their education. So I'm not sure if that clarifies that a little bit.
Gabby, there's also a question in the chat that I know you
Sure.
addressed a little bit of at the beginning, but I don't remember you talked about gender. So Moira asked what the differences are in the socioeconomic groups as well as gender.
So I don't know the socioeconomic groups off the top of my head. I don't think we have a lot of data on sort of household income. We could look at the Pell differences between the two. But so regarding gender, around 2/3 of our group of online students is going to be female, and that's going to be compared to, right over half of the group of in-person students. So both groups, again, majority female, but the online students are around, 60-some% female. So I think we provide some more details on, I know we provide some more details on demographic breakdown in the paper itself as well.
Well, all right. If there are no more
Hey, Gaby,
questions,
can I
go
can I
ahead,
ask a
please.
question?
Sure.
I just wanted to follow up on Eric's question from before about location. And I don't know if the Virginia is different than Massachusetts here. One of the advantages, I think, well, I think mostly community college students probably tend to go to the community college that's closest to them. But under online, you don't have to do that anymore. So you have students that can sign up at in here in Massachusetts for cheaper credits someplace else, or for a wider variety of credits at another community college. And I don't know if that would affect the fact that, you know, you're going to try something because it's cheaper or something else, and then find out that, oh, it's not what you thought. So I don't
Yeah,
know if the system is.
that's a great point. Students can sign up at any of the colleges across the state. So for example, the course that I took at the VCCS, so I'm in Charlottesville, but I took this online course in Northern Virginia at the college that's outside of DC. So students are able to sort of, based on course offerings at different colleges, can enroll online if there's a course they want to take and it's not offered at their college. So yeah, I think the breakdown of courses between the two groups is something that we looked at, but of course I don't remember off the top of my head, but it would be good to see if, you know, students are less likely to take sort of the base English 111, 112 sort of course online because they have more options to test things like you just mentioned. That's a great point. Yes, the full paper is available online. I will try to pull up a link and put it in the chat really quickly. It's going to be in the Annenberg paper series. Let's see. Here we go. Great, so there is the link to the paper. Again, if you have any other thoughts or questions that you would like to share with me, I'd be happy to see emails about that, or, you know, if you want to set up a separate time to talk about things. Thanks again for listening. I really appreciate all of your time. And I'm sure you're all Zoom fatigued. So thanks again for taking the time to jump on and listen to me talk for an hour.
Indeed. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. It was quite interesting to hear. And thank you everybody for joining us. Our next talk is on Thursday, March 25th. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.